and we are back for Overanalyzing House of the Dragon. After going over all of the events leading up to the war, we are now at the beginning of the Dance of the Dragons, with Rhaenyra's Blacks facing off against Aegon's Greens. We understand quite well why the factions formed, and now, in the wake of Viserys' death, we are here to explore the event that ignites the war: the Green Council. The council convened in the Queen's apartments within Maegor's Holdfast. Many accounts have come down to us of what was said and done that night. By far, the most detailed and authoritative of them is Grand Maester Munkin's The Dance of the Dragons, a true telling. Though Munkin's exhaustive history was not written until a generation later, and drew on many different sorts of materials, including Maester's chronicles, memoirs, Steward's records, and interviews with 147 surviving witnesses to the great events of these times, his account of the inner workings of the court relies upon the confessions of Grand Maester Orwyle, as set down before his execution. Unlike Mushroom and Septon Eustace, whose versions derive from rumors, hearsay, and family legend, the Grand Maester was present at the meeting and took part in the council's deliberations and decisions. Though it must be recognized that, at the time he wrote, Orwyle was most anxious to show himself in a favorable light, and absolve himself of any blame for what was to follow. Munkin's true telling therefore paints his predecessor in perhaps too favorable a light. And so here we come to the story of the Green Council, which at its heart is an enormous retcon from A Feast for Crows, where Aerion and Aerys Oakheart discussed the Dance of the Dragons. In that story, Kristen Cole is the most important character, deciding to change the heir from Rhaenyra to Aegon as Viserys lays dying. Now, it's the Green Council making the decision, and Kristen Cole is just a bit player. And so starting things off, we get a paragraph on sourcing that does not appear in the original Princess and the Queen, but is added for Fire and Blood. We find out that Gyldain's history is based mostly on the history of Grand Maester Munkin, but that history is based on the confessions of Grand Maester Orwyle, which according to Gyldain is a biased source. And I do have to say that this paragraph is a bit sloppily written. First of all, the action of the first sentence, that the Green Council convened in the Queen's apartments, is repeated in the very next paragraph. But beyond this, the paragraph is confusing on first read in that it's trying to do two somewhat different things at once. It's trying to introduce us to a new source, Munkin, in a general sense, the whole war, while trying to talk about the bias of a different source, Orwyle, in a particular instance, the Green Council. And so when Gyldain starts talking about Mushroom and Eustace's versions in the middle of the paragraph, it's a bit confusing as Mushroom and Eustace both wrote versions of the whole war too. But actually Gyldain has switched back to talking about just the Green Council, so what Gyldain means is the Mushroom and Eustace's versions of that event. Now with Fire and Blood, I do think our author is trying to shoehorn in Grand Maester Munkin and his true telling, as it is a character and a book actually mentioned in A Dance with Dragons. In Tyrion 3, Tyrion and Haldon Halfmaester argue about which dragon was killed by Byron's swan, and Tyrion thinks that Grand Maester Munkin has erred in his true telling. And so our author's mechanism for putting in Munkin is primarily by saying that Munkin's account is Orwyle's account. That is, the true telling is based on Orwyle's confessions written down at the end of the war. In fact, over and over and over, dozens of times in Fire and Blood, we hear that Munkin is based on Orwyle, and true telling is based on confessions. But here's the weird thing. If Orwyle's confessions exist as a primary source, written at the war's end, why would anyone cite the secondary source true telling from a generation later? Just say, according to Orwyle. After all, we never hear about the confessions being a lost source. It's rather odd that we have to keep hearing about Munkin and our author clumsily explaining it's based on Orwyle over and over. Now, one can perhaps make the argument that Munkin and later Gyldain are covering something up that's in Orwyle's confessions, and by only citing Munkin we avoid or conceal the information, but we have little idea on what exactly that would be. Now, I do have to say that Orwyle himself is a fascinating character whose loyalties are not clear. He certainly was not for the Black faction, and did serve Aegon, and he was imprisoned by Rhaenyra and Cregan Stark, both Blacks, and he was saved from execution by Tywin Lannister, a prominent Green, though he was later killed by Greens. And there are some things right from the beginning that didn't exactly serve the Green cause, such as causing conflict during this Green Council. And so there is a question to whether his true loyalties lie somewhere else, that perhaps he was part of a deeper conspiracy. And we will explore this more in just a bit. Gathering in the Queen's chambers, as the body of her Lord Husband grew cold above, were Queen Alicent herself, her father, Sir Otto Hightower, Hand of the King, Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Grand Maester Orwyle, Lord Lyman Beesbury, Master of Coin, a man of 80, Sir Tywin Lannister, Master of Ships, brother to the Lord of Casterly Rock, Larry Strong, called Larry's Clubfoot, Lord of Harrenhal, Master of Whisperers, and Lord Jasper Wilde, called Ironrod, Master of Laws. Grand Maester Munkin dubs this gathering the Green Council in his true telling. And so here we get a little lie from Gildane. The council did not gather while the body grew cold. As we discussed last time, it's been many hours since Viserys died, at least 3. His body is well and cold. Gildane makes it seem like the meeting took place right after Viserys' death, when it most certainly did not. And then we get a little roll call of who attended the so-called Green Council, the final line being a later addition for Fire and Blood, mentioning the source of Munkin again. By the way, the term Green Council is used both in The Princess and the Queen and Fire and Blood to describe 2 things. First, the gathering after Viserys' death as an event. This event is the Green Council. Beesbury dies at the Green Council, the event. But the Green Council is also used as a term synonymous with Aegon's Small Council. One can say, for example, that Jasper Wilde was a member of the Green Council. The Green Council made decisions throughout the war. Now, this same roll call was shoved in at the end of the last chapter, so we don't need to repeat who's on it again, but it's worth asking who the sources for information are on it. Again, sourcing was kind of a later addition by our author, so when originally written, little thought was given to how this information actually got out. But as edited for Fire and Blood, sourcing is much discussed, and there is definitely a big lingering question of who spilled the beans about what went down at the Green Council. We know that one of the sources is Grand Maester Orwyle, but both Mushroom and Septon Eustace seem to believe and report on another source as more reliable. And this wasn't just made-up information from Septon Eustace and Mushroom. The source was able to produce identical dialogue to Orwyle's account. The problem is, almost everyone on the council dies, or would have little opportunity or desire to talk to Mushroom or Eustace. Keep in mind, Beesbury is murdered during this council, and the other participants would have been tight-lipped. And even among them, there are only 2 survivors of the war, Tywin Lannister and Alicent Hightower. It's possible that Tywin Lannister spoke of it, but near the end of his life he claimed he couldn't even remember who was a black or a green. And Alicent went kind of nuts at the end and began talking to herself. Perhaps a septa or serving girl overheard an account of events, but again, the dialogue reported is near identical to Orwyle. It's very accurate, so both Tywin and Alicent seem improbable. In the end, though perhaps our author didn't really think this through, the most logical source for Mushroom and Eustace is probably some random serving man or Kingsguard who had an ear to the door. Grand Maester Orwyle opened the meeting by reviewing the customary tasks and procedures required at the death of a king. He said, Septon Eustace should be summoned to perform the last rites and pray for the king's soul. A raven must needs be sent to Dragonstone at once to inform Princess Rhaenyra of her father's passing. Mayhaps her grace the queen would care to write the message, so as to soften these sad tidings with some words of condolence. The bells are always rung to announce the death of a king. Someone should see to that. And of course, we must begin to make our preparations for Queen Rhaenyra's coronation. And so here we get a very interesting paragraph that makes us wonder what Grand Maester Orwyle's game is exactly. This paragraph is some of the best evidence that Orwyle is, at best, a reluctant Green supporter, and who most likely has a different agenda. He almost certainly was someone who was not at the pre-Green Council. Now, if you notice, Orwyle's words are needlessly incendiary, and seem to be secretly pushing the council towards conflict. In fact, I would say his words are almost devilishly manipulative, allowing tempers to rise. On a side note, this paragraph is untouched from The Princess and the Queen, and there is no conflicting account from Mushroom and Eustace. These are Orwyle's words. He really said this. So, regarding the manipulation, Orwyle first calls for prayer, and then he suggests that Alicent send condolences to Rhaenyra, which is quite rich. It's no secret that Rhaenyra and Alicent have a strained relationship, and Alicent would certainly not want to do this. Not to mention, the widow of the king should be in as much grief as the daughter. The queen sending condolences rather than receiving them is wholly inappropriate and rather insulting. The queen is supposed to be in mourning. Why would anyone ask her to pick up a quill? To say nothing of the feelings of Aegon and the other children, who are wholly ignored. So right off the bat, Orwyle seems to be antagonizing Alicent, and by extension Otto. Then, Orwyle, in describing what they should do, makes a rather large jump. He says that the bells should be rung to announce the king's death, and then they need to make preparations for Rhaenyra's coronation. There is, of course, quite a bit missing here. Obviously, when a king dies, the family must be informed, his body must be prepared, a funeral occurs where the family gathers. Not to mention, there's issues of inheritance, security for the city, stability in the realm. But he skips over all of this and brings up Rhaenyra's coronation. Orwyle absolutely must know that the Hightowers hoped for Aegon to rule over Rhaenyra. After all, Otto was dismissed for pestering Viserys about it, and later Beesbury brings up the fact that Alicent and the Greens would constantly pester the king about it as well. And yet here Orwyle bluntly brings up a coronation. That is, a celebration for Rhaenyra taking power. And just after annoying the Hightowers about the condolences issue. It is no wonder that Otto, rather emotionally, breaks in after this. Sir Otto Hightower cut him off. "All this must needs wait," he declared, "until the question of succession is settled." As the king's hand, he was empowered to speak with the king's voice, even to sit the Iron Throne in the king's absence. Viserys had granted him the authority to rule over the Seven Kingdoms, and until such time as our new king is crowned, that rule would continue. And so here Otto jumps in and cuts off Orwyle to say that the question of succession needs to be settled, and then he points out rather bluntly that he is in charge until a new king is crowned. Now, of course, there is no question of succession. Viserys was very clear that Rhaenyra was heir, and both Orwyle and Beesbury, who apparently were not at the pre-Green Council or conspiring with the others, assume Rhaenyra will rule. What is rather clear is that Otto was hoping to use the Green Council to make succession a question, and then through dialogue have the rest of the small council, namely Beesbury and Orwyle, come around to choosing Aegon. After all, Otto probably didn't plan this meeting expecting to murder Beesbury. That seemed to happen when the conversation went poorly. Beesbury realized the meeting was not a real discussion, but only a coup, and then tries to leave. Otto probably hoped to trick Beesbury into thinking that this was some noble meeting of minds that would naturally conclude Aegon should be king. And that, of course, didn't happen. And so it does seem that the line, "until such time as our new king is crowned," was Otto misspeaking. Rather than this being an event where a conversation happens about succession that leads to a conclusion, Otto reveals that he's already prejudged the situation. Essentially, Otto slips up here, goes masks off, and reveals that this is a coup before the discussion even begins. And so naturally the conversation that follows is a heated argument. And so if we accept that this was a misspeak, we have to look at the cause of the misspeak, which happens to be Orwyle riling him up. "Until our new queen is crowned," someone said. In Grand Maester Munkin's account, the words are Orwyle's, softly spoken, no more than a quibble, but Mushroom and Septon Eustace insist it was Lord Beesbury who spoke up, in a waspish tone. "King," insisted Queen Alicent, "the Iron Throne by rights must pass to his Grace's eldest trueborn son." And so, as we see, the conversation quickly goes off the rails after Otto's possible misspeak, with someone saying queen and then Alicent insisting king. Now, the someone who speaks queen is in question in Fire and Blood, with Munkin claiming it's Orwyle, which means in Orwyle's account, he claims it's himself. But both Mushroom and Eustace claim it's Beesbury, and it's worth noting that in the original Princess and the Queen, It's Beesbury. There's no mention of it possibly being Orwyle. And honestly speaking, of course it's Beesbury and not Orwyle. Beesbury is murdered later, while Orwyle is not. It makes no sense that Orwyle would be making arguments for hours, and then to have Beesbury suddenly pipe up at the end and get murdered. The dialogue matches Beesbury, creating a logical flow to the ending. And if Orwyle were questioning Aegon's legitimacy too much, he probably wouldn't have been left on as Grand Maester. Or if he were, he would not be as trusted as he was. Now, it is notable that in this new, biased Munkin account in Fire and Blood, there is not just a claim that Orwyle might have spoken it, but there's a claim that he spoke it softly, as if Orwyle is trying not to anger people. Of course, the response by Alicent shows that she was in fact angered. Emotions had risen quickly, and this seems to be due to Orwyle's original comments, the ones he actually said. The discussion that followed lasted nigh until dawn. Grand Maester Munkin tells us. Mushroom and Septon Eustace concur. In their accounts, only Lord Beesbury spoke on behalf of Princess Rhaenyra. The ancient Master of Coin, who had served King Viserys for the majority of his reign, and his grandfather Jaehaerys the Old King before him, reminded the council that Rhaenyra was older than her brothers and had more Targaryen blood, that the late king had chosen her as his successor, and that he had repeatedly refused to alter the succession despite the pleadings of Queen Alicent and her Greens, that hundreds of lords and landed knights had done obeisance to the princess in 105 AC and sworn solemn oaths to defend her rights. Grand Maester Orwyle's account differs only in that he puts many of these arguments into his own mouth, rather than Beesbury's, but subsequent events suggest that was not so, as we shall see. And so next we get the argument that Rhaenyra should be the ruler, given by, again, a mystery person, either Orwyle or Beesbury. And again, in the original Princess and the Queen, it's just Beesbury. And, of course, it's Beesbury. The murder and the dialogue just fit him. Even Gildane admits at the end of the Fire and Blood paragraph that it's Beesbury. Now, besides the sourcing, there is one other change from the Princess and the Queen version to Fire and Blood with this paragraph, and that is correcting Beesbury's reign as Master of Coin. In the original Princess and the Queen, our author claims that Beesbury was Master of Coin for the entire Viserys reign. This changed to majority in Fire and Blood as, in The Rogue Prince, it's established that Daemon was briefly Master of Coin. Now, I will say that the conversation of the Green Council is said to last a long time. It seems to last hours, apparently, and realistically, there doesn't seem to be a good reason for this argument to be hours long. Did Ironrod's history lesson really go on for hours? But whatever. Also, it's strange that Beesbury brings forward a couple of arguments that are pretty weak, Rhaenyra being older being the first. This is a self-defeating argument within a Westeros that has no Dorne. After all, older coming before younger, and son coming before daughter is the Westerosi succession. The question before us is really monarch's choice versus the law of the land. Bringing up Rhaenyra's advantage with one half of the law of the land just invites one to think about the other half of the law. The second weak argument is that Rhaenyra has more Targaryen blood, which is an argument never used before and never used after for determining a monarch. Keep in mind, when Baelon was chosen over Rhaenys in 92, the arguments for each claimant are given, and no one mentions the fact that Baelon has more Targaryen blood. During the Council of 101, arguments are given for claimants as well, and Viserys' blood purity is not mentioned. It's really weird that it comes up here, as we've only seen Targaryens themselves really care about so-called blood purity. No one else has ever cared, and I'm not sure why Beesbury would care about this or why he would think it would sway anyone. He might be repeating something Viserys said, but if Viserys cared about blood purity, why would he marry Alicent? And wouldn't Aegon's children's blood purity be a factor? Even if Viserys and Beesbury cared about blood purity for dragon riding or something, it doesn't really hold up as Aegon's children have dragons. Whatever the case, these first two arguments are so weak that they are promptly ignored by the small council and never mentioned again. I suspect our author was simply adding arguments in this paragraph to help balance the long list of arguments that are then given for Aegon. It is the third point that Beesbury makes that is by far the strongest argument, and really the only one that matters. Viserys chose Rhaenyra, and lords vowed to follow her. In fact, Beesbury doesn't really go far enough. He could have mentioned that Jaehaerys chose his heir with Aemon, then chose his heir with Baelon, and even chose his heir with Viserys after the Council of 101. Choosing a successor is really the Targaryen tradition. But these words fell on ears made of stone. Sir Tyland pointed out that many of the lords who had sworn to defend the succession of Princess Rhaenyra were long dead. "It has been 24 years, he said. "I myself swore no such oath. I was a child at the time." Ironrod, the Master of Laws, cited the Great Council of 101 and the old king's choice of Baelon rather than Rhaenys in 92, then discoursed at length about Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters and the hallowed Andal tradition wherein the rights of a true-born son always came before the rights of a mere daughter. Sir Otto reminded them that Rhaenyra's husband was none other than Prince Daemon, and we all know that one's nature. Make no mistake, should Rhaenyra ever sit the Iron Throne, it will be Lord Flea Bottom who rules us, a king consort as cruel and unforgiving as Maegor ever was. My own head will be the first cut off, I do not doubt, but your queen, my daughter, will soon follow. And so here we get the response to Beesbury from the rest of the small council on why Aegon should be king. By the way, the paragraph begins with a Bible-like phrase about words falling on ears made of stone. In the Bible, stone hearts or hardened hearts are synonymous with stubborn hearts, most notably the Pharaoh of Exodus, whose heart is hardened, and then his land is made to endure a battery of plagues. These are stone ears, but it's essentially the same situation. We have stubbornness, which will bring plagues upon Westeros. Now in this paragraph we hear from Tywin Lannister, Jasper Wilde, and Otto Hightower, and then in subsequent paragraphs we are going to hear from Alicent and Criston Cole. The pack's arguments seem very prepared and complimentary. It seems impossible that they were improvised on the spot, and so it seems likely that these five were scheming at the pre-Green Council, if not before. So Tywin Lannister goes first, questioning whether the oaths of parents legally pass to children. Many of the lords are dead, and he himself made no such oath as he was a child. And indeed, fealty and oaths were complicated legal mechanisms in medieval times. It's difficult to know if the oath of the lord passes to the heir. It probably depends on the oath, the conditions, and the circumstances. That said, Tywin is absolutely being a worm here, as he's not the Lord of Casterly Rock. His twin brother Jason is. Whether Tywin made an oath or not is completely irrelevant, yet he places himself among the lords who may have been commanded to follow Rhaenyra. His opinion on a lord's oath is irrelevant, as he's not even a lord outside of being Master of Coin. And as Master of Coin, his opinion is irrelevant. He's not the Master of Law. Jasper Wilde could perhaps speak on the inheritance of oaths, but he ignores this issue. Now I will say that Tywin's statement that it's been 24 years is also quite ironic, as yes, on its own 24 years seems like a long time, but his statements are followed by a gaggle of people who are living well in the past. You see, after Tywin, we get Jasper Wilde's discussion about the Council of 101, Baelon being chosen over Rhaenys in 92, and Aegon the Conqueror having right over his sisters during the conquest, all of which happened more than 24 years ago. Now some may argue that this is law and precedent matters, except that oaths in medieval times were legal instruments. Hundreds of lords swearing vows is in fact legal precedent. But Jasper Wilde ignores this issue, allowing the Master of Coin to speak on it. And beyond this, Jasper's interpretation of history also focuses on the male being chosen over the female, though one could easily focus on the male being chosen over the female. Jaehaerys chose Viserys after the Council of 101. Jaehaerys chose Baelon over Rhaenys. Legal precedent supports monarch's choice, which favors Rhaenyra. And then we get Otto criticizing Rhaenyra for being married to Daemon, and claiming that Daemon is like Maegor the Cruel and calling him Lord Flea Bottom. Now, not only is Otto ignoring the character of Aegon, which by all accounts was not a good one, his criticism of Daemon is from 24 years ago. It was in 105 that Otto sent a letter to his brother claiming that Daemon was like Maegor the Cruel, and it was in 105 that he called him Lord Flea Bottom, back when Daemon was head of the Goldcloaks. Otto's opinion of Daemon is from 24 years ago, when Daemon was 24 years old. He's now 48, and Otto has spent almost no time in the same location with Daemon since 105. Now, Otto predicts that if Rhaenyra sits the throne, Daemon will be cruel and unforgiving. His own head will be the first to be cut off, and Alicent's will soon follow. Of those 3 predictions, only his own beheading ends up being accurate, though it had nothing to do with Daemon. Admittedly, this is not the best place to stop, but this video is getting long, and the events of the Green Council continue on for a bit. So we will return to the Green Council in part 30. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.